Okay, I'm very excited to introduce our next trend author duo. Robbie Hammond is President and Chief Strategy Officer, and Omar Toro-Vaca is Chief Development Officer, both for Therme Group US. Robbie is famous for the High Line in New York City and was a keynote at the Global Wellness Summit in Tel Aviv. Robbie's favorite social wellness activity, and I think this really is a good one to tell all young parents, is having friends come over to have dinner with our kids and then helping them put them to bed. That is genius. Genius. It helps his mental health because it can get so boring. That is so true. And he gets to see friends, which he hasn't seen for a while. I think that's brilliant. Omar likes to tend to his vegetable garden and cook for his friends, the number one thing that still gives him happiness and makes him feel so well. But in keeping with the urban theme of their topic, Omar also offered that his penchant for frequenting Russian and Turkish baths in the East Village with a different friend on occasion is likely more on message. Please welcome Robbie Hammond and Omar Toro-Vaca to tell us about wellness in cities. Urban infrastructure just might save cities.
We're going to stand as part of our personal wellness. So I'm Robbie Hammond, and I'll start off with something sort of a personal part of this trend to me. So my dad keeps asking me why the F I would ever have left the High Line to go to this thing called Therme that he can't pronounce and has no idea what it is. And one of the reasons I joined Therme is I love contrast therapy, I love pools, and I love doing that in a social environment. So that's perfect for being here and in the first trend. But the other thing was that it was a mass market. Thermas are sort of a water-based, giant, 500,000 square foot facilities. And that's what interested me, is that it was really a mass market product. They cost a lot of money to build, but they're only profitable because they can have over 1 million people a year. 10,000 people can attend in one day on a holiday. And so that's what, and that's where we started thinking of urban wellness infrastructure, is because what we need to do to solve this, what I think at its base, wellness sort of at a crisis level is a health issue, a health crisis we're having around the world. And we need, and I think wellness has been at the forefront, and it's really been, at spa, hospitality, but only able to do it in sort of smaller groups. And so what I think is going to be necessary is how do we do this on a huge scale? And Therme is doing it at a private scale. And, again, I think companies need to see this as profitable, that this mass market, not just a luxury market, is profitable wellness. And we also need to see it at a nonprofit level. And then I think most importantly, what is the relationship between the private and public sector coming together to do this?
So I'm Omar, hello. So of course this gave us the opportunity to define an urban wellness infrastructure. And we think of it as 3 component parts. The first of which is infrastructure improvements, typical capital expenditures to fix things or build new things. The second is business opportunities, right? When you're building new things, ideally you're triggering something else to happen economically down the road or as a result of that initial investment. And finally, programs that are targeting social, mental, and physical well-being. And all these things working together start to operate at the scale of infrastructure. And the key distinction between infrastructure and new businesses just doing what new businesses do, which is innovate and create new markets, is essentially making sure that the benefits are serving people who can't traditionally afford to access them for themselves. That's really important because as we started looking at trends or components of this trend around the globe, it was people who really changed the way in which other people gained access that became the most interesting examples of the trend.
So I was in Singapore last year and meeting with their people that run the tourism agency, which is one of the highest level cabinet positions. And they are reorienting their entire hospitality tourism around wellness. Not business travel, but wellness travel. That's their entire, sort of one of their primary planks of their economic platform of the whole country. And that's on their sort of hospitality tourism. And then when they're thinking of housing, wellness is up there with affordable housing and the environmental issues. So that's, you can always sort of look at Singapore to be sort of ahead of probably where we should be. And I think one of the important things is, I don't think all countries are going to do this, all businesses are going to do this. Most cities are not going to do this. I think it's the cities that are going to be successful, the companies that are going to be successful, are going to look at this as an opportunity or a necessity. And then on the nonprofit scale, I'll use sort of the High Line as an old school example. The High Line was really, what was innovative about the High Line was bringing sort of high-end design, architecture that was usually, happening in fancy museums or in the private sector. We brought it to the public. And of course, there was wellness, there was walking. But we didn't take into account that it would not benefit everyone, and that the benefits were not spread equally. And so I think the new example of what you're going to see in nonprofits is a project called the 11th Street Bridge in Washington. Amazing design, Real Cool House is designing, but that's not what they're leading with. They're leading with and wellness at a very base level. Like, if you can't have economic security, you cannot have wellness. So they raised $40 million for a land trust before they built the park. They're thinking of what is going to change in the city, sort of what are the cultural things they need to think? What is about the health of the community? So in some ways, the park is really an excuse for thinking about these much larger issues around gentrification. You think, oh, gentrification, that's an economic issue. Well, it's a wellness issue. Again, I think one of the most impactful things that I heard, in Tel Aviv was that if you don't have enough money, you cannot have wellness. If you are in poverty, it's almost impossible to have a higher level of wellness. And so I think you're not going to see any large-scale public nonprofits that are not putting that at the center. And you can still put design and innovative things like that there, but you're going to have to put these other things, I think, at the forefront.
So Robbie talked about Therme serving, thousands and thousands of people. It's a 500,000 square foot facility typically, and sometimes larger. Every place we look, we strike a chord, right, with an anti-development kind of reaction, right? And so, I was a lobbyist for 4 years, and during those 4 years, I learned that community engagement is key to any project's success. But more importantly, as we think about wellness, we also think about partnerships in the community as being the basis of what's going to make a project successful, right? So it's not just the building of a 500,000 square foot facility, the landscape around it. It's what can that building under the umbrella of well-being and community relations do as a catalyst for unlocking, and even in some cases, righting the wrongs that have been done in communities that are often underserved, not just underserved historically by transit, underserved by not having access to food or groceries. And so we looked at communities in which every instance of looking at underutilized land, whether it's formerly industrial or land that just is tied up in bureaucracy, right? A land transfer between the federal government and local government. In every case, the surrounding communities around that piece of land had many stories to tell, both about wellness, but also about the future they want for their community, what they learned during the pandemic, how they shifted their priorities from being reactionary to gentrification and development to perhaps being partners in the future of their communities with government in particular.
So in a nutshell, I liked what you said, Robbie, about it's not every city, although I keep reading about more and more incredible green projects, social design, nudge architecture, community projects all over the world. It's probably, again, another thing that came out. Our cities were exposed as deeply unwell, people that lived in cities worldwide. And this, to me, is like the most exciting thing because it's accessible. It brings it to cities, but I think it's interesting that you say that it'll be the successful cities that, and cities, as you say in your report, go through these, every 100 years or so, they're redefined, they have a new identity, and our last iteration was retail and office space. And this, every time I read about New York City is going to get beaches and parks, I mean, it's just so exciting, right? But I encourage everyone to read it. It's a trend that impacts real people, millions and hundreds of millions of real people. Thank you.